I would like to hand over next to AB Mokhatsane, Head of Brand and Communications at Vodacom, who will be facilitating our next discussion, which is innovation spurred by the COVID crisis. I hand it over to you, but AB.
Thank you so much, Chloe. I'm really, really honored to be part of this panel. It's the first time I'm facilitating, so please bear with me. But I'm really excited because we have an incredible topic to discuss with some incredible speakers. COVID has definitely created a crisis. And somebody said once, you must never waste a good crisis. And we're definitely not going to do that. The incredible panel that we've got today is really going to go through some Zoom polls, responses to some of the polls that you guys are going to put up. We're going to give you an opportunity to ask some questions that I'll put to the panelists. I want it to flow. I want it to be energetic. So really, if you feel that you want to comment on anything, pop it into the questions, and then I'll raise it up with the panelists. Instead of me going through and introducing the panelists one by one, I've asked them to really just introduce themselves as they go through the session. And what I'd like the panelists to really do while they're introducing themselves is speak about who they are, what they do, and what in their view is an incredible innovation that their company has done to really add to this whole context of innovation within a COVID world. So with no further ado, I'm going to start with Pritesh. Pritesh, welcome. Give us an introduction. We've got 2 minutes each.
Fantastic. Good morning, AB. Thanks for having me on, and good morning to everyone attending today as well. So it has been an interesting time. So to give you a bit of my background, my name is Pritesh Syurch. I am the CEO of The Luries. The Luries is the largest brand communication and advertising festival across Africa and the Middle East. And our role really is to just support this creative ecosystem and ensure that this creative ecosystem exists and is strong enough to support the turning of economies. We're a non-profit organization, so I think that's the dynamic that's different maybe versus my colleagues on the panel itself. But one of the things that we've been doing that's a little bit different is that we've come from a festival that happens once a year and almost become a educational platform now. So we've moved into education and a support program. So that's one of the innovations that's come from this COVID-19 pandemic. We're actually applying a lot of the thinking that I've brought from my previous organization, where I was involved as the Chief Innovation Analyst and CEO of Product of the Year, where we're bringing the kind of thinking of how do we actually add value in this really, really difficult time and ensure that we're creating a strong ecosystem that supports creativity across Africa and the Middle East.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. I'd like to move on to Shobna from Unilever.
Hey, Abby, thanks very much for having me. I hope you can hear. I see the mute sign on there, but
no, we can hear you perfect.
Okay, great. So I work at Unilever and serve together with the leadership team to serve our consumers daily throughout the country and the world, very especially in the home care, nutrition, as well as the beauty and personal care categories. And the COVID-19 pandemic has shown that our internal reports and together with the Mintel-based reports have shown that there's been some 22,200 innovations launched globally, 35% of which have shown new variety launches or line extensions, 38% have been a completely new product, and 77% are new relaunches, and 19% are repackaging, and 1% a complete new reformulation. And South Africa is in the top 20 of that list of innovation. And at Unilever, we've had to really look hard at how we produce sanitizer and home care and hygiene products, very especially to fight COVID-19. So it's a great conversation because all companies had to look at how we innovate in this difficult time. Thank you, Abby.
Shobna, it's Ryan here. It looks like AB is frozen out. And so with your kind permission, I'll step in and fill the empty space and just proceed to introduce myself. I'm Ryan Noach. I'm the Chief Exec at Discovery Health. And this has been a particularly interesting time for healthcare right across the globe. And of course, for us as a healthcare funder and a disruptive innovator in a healthcare system, equally so. It's a great pleasure to be with you here today to talk about this important topic. You know, innovation is central to our DNA at Discovery. It's what we eat, breathe, and sleep. And so this has been an exciting time for us in that respect. Of course, we're deeply concerned about the well-being of our stakeholders, members, and constituency, and more broadly, all South Africans. Abby's question was, what is one standout innovation that you've brought to market in this time? I guess there have been many innovations from us by need and by design because of our role in the healthcare system. But we brought to market a free access to all virtual consultations, a telemedicine consult for doctors in a partnership together with Vodacom, Abby's company, where any South African can access a doctor through a telemedicine link, get a consultation, the doctor gets paid for it. And this means much broader access at a time of a healthcare crisis to good primary healthcare. And of course also means sustained income for doctors who at this time are struggling to run their practices as usual. Importantly, protects doctors against continuous exposure to high viral loads through seeing patients all the time. And by doing so through a telemedicine link really does mean that we're deploying digital to protect everyone and improve accessibility. That stands out for us amongst a whole range of other things, notwithstanding the issue of having to now deliver vitality and wellness activities at home, considering that all the gyms are closed. And so a whole reinvention of our Vitality program linked to wearable devices to make sure that Vitality members are still incentivized and are able to exercise at home and achieve rewards. Exciting time for us within the austere time for the whole globe of a very serious pandemic. Back to you, Abby. It looks like you're back online.
Thank you so much, Ryan. I think people should get bonus points for working out at home because it's really difficult to get that motivation level up. Kenzie is next from Nedbank.
Hi, thanks, AB. So as you said, I'm Kenzie. And I have to say, before I introduce myself, I'm quite inspired by hearing some of the innovations that come from, your Discovery and your Unilevers of the world. And like you said, it's so great to see organizations not wasting a good crisis. So I head up marketing and corporate affairs at Nedbank. And I think a big part of why we've put marketing and corporate affairs together is we believe it's a big play on how the brand lands in the market. So to AB's question around, what we've done from an innovation perspective, as everyone has said, COVID-19 has presented us with a massive pandemic that's altered all norms and social behaviors. For us as a bank, we've seen a significant shift in behavior, specifically to digital, being an enabler, obviously, of remote services. And interestingly, in this environment, we've completely believed that our purpose of using our financial expertise to do good is even more relevant in this current environment. And this was actually echoed a lot in the public sentiment on the expectations of what banks should be doing for society in this environment. So I just wanted to highlight maybe just the one innovation that we're proud of. So besides having to set up all the payment holidays, pay the small businesses through the SEFT fund, I think the one thing that we're quite proud of is something that was in play already in the bank, but we've had to accelerate and pivot given the crisis. So our digital transformation has led us to become the first in Africa to launch an application programming interface on API platform, which is aligned with open banking standards. So for us to participate in an open banking ecosystem, it's important that our financial products and services are required to be exposed digitally in an easily consumable, safe, and stable platform for external parties to consume. This marketplace is seen as the core channel platform enabler to allow us to be able to compete in open banking in Africa. So our API marketplace is a self-service portal that enables companies outside of Nedbank to create financial products that are based on our platform and services. But I think what's even more important is that it enables better access to financial services based on integration and products developed by e-commerce companies as well as fintech companies. Using that API platform, we've launched our new super app, which is the Avo app. Yes, avocado, which is obviously a super fruit. So initially we launched Avo on the 23rd of March, and it was a purely internal launch to about 300 staff members. And the focus of the launch from a services perspective was going to be entertainment, travel, some shopping, as well as some essential services. As you can imagine, a lot of these services were no longer relevant under lockdown. But beyond that, we actually strongly believed that we needed to move the offering to beyond the 300 staff members that were going to be part of the beta offering. So as COVID hit us, we accelerated the launch to a much broader group of people, as well as focusing the launch comms on the online grocery offering and some 15 home essential services such as finding a plumber, electrician, security, gas refills, etc. And yesterday we actually went public to some really good feedback on the app itself. So we think it's a big part of how we're going to open up banking and hopefully get more consumers to have access to some level of financial services. So I think for Nedbank, the epidemic has called for unity, deep sense of humanity from businesses, and we've had to play our part by supporting the various disaster relief initiatives. But more than that, I think we've strongly believed and felt that we have an opportunity and a responsibility to do far more for our customers than merely providing financial services. Thanks, AB.
Thank you so much for that, Kent. I think everyone can see that we've got some really incredible leaders here that are leading the way in terms of how we are innovating going forward. Now, as said, we're going to go into 3 Zoom polls, and we'd really love your engagement at this particular point. The first poll that we're going to put up right now is really getting your view on what aspects do you think the next big wave of innovation is likely to tackle as the global crisis progresses. Is it testing? Is it contact tracing? Is it mental health issues? Or the vaccine? I'd really like your input at that particular point in time. Pritesh, while we're waiting for that answer, we heard from young people earlier this week around innovation. How do you think that what your organization is doing is stimulating young people in coming up with innovation to tackle COVID?
Yeah, I think, within our space and not just our space, but within community at large, one of the challenges that you are going to find from this COVID-19 pandemic is that young people are one of the most vulnerable groups in this. You may have older groups who are vulnerable from a health perspective, but from an economic perspective, it's the young groups who are quite vulnerable at this stage, purely because they're first within the organizations. They're the easiest people to let go of because they haven't necessarily made the right amount of impact. So one of the things that we're doing is exploring ways in terms of which we can support that youth ecosystem. We've got our partners, great partners that we're working with and exploring different ways we can do it. But the way it's actually distilled is in terms of education. We realize that if you're able to upskill yourself during this time or use some of this downtime to kind of gain extra knowledge and actually gain exposure to different individuals, this is one of the times that it can actually make a difference going forward. So we're working with various organizations that work with youth to upskill them. We've got our own webinars that we've now put into place, which is very, very well supported by the youth. We have one later today, which we have His Excellency Tami Mseleko, who's the South African ambassador to Nigeria, who's going to be speaking to youth across the industry about how they can actually support themselves across borders, not just within South Africa itself.
Great stuff. And I think that's a really good point around really the youth upskilling themselves to have the skills to be able to address the challenges that we have. The answer to the poll question that came out most was, you really think that vaccines are going to be the next wave of innovation? Ryan, I mean, vaccines for many people are just this kind of really weird space that we really not used to. It seems as though they take forever to get right. There's all the stuff around testing that needs to happen. Can you just explain to us as a medical doctor, what is actually involved in innovating around a vaccine?
Yeah. AB, this is something now that's suddenly become of global interest, of course. Yeah. I think what's favorable around the vaccine discovery process that we're seeing now is that vaccine discoverers typically tend to race each other for vaccine development, But what we're seeing that's different now in COVID-19 is that they're racing the virus. They're all working together. There's an open source pool of information. They're co-innovating and co-developing. And as opposed to competition between manufacturers, which is traditionally what you see in the drug discovery space, there's collaboration between manufacturers to come up using each other's learnings with the fastest vaccine development. That's a first. That's not something we've ever seen. And typically these global pharmaceutical manufacturers, don't behave that way. But because of the human crisis we're facing, linked to, as a result, an economic crisis, it really is a good development. One other very quick point is to say the fastest we really ever see a vaccine develop from historic vaccine discovery processes is about 5 years. But in this situation, with this cooperation, co-development, government sponsorship, and almost an unlimited budget for vaccine discovery, there is a real hope that it will be much faster. And our leading South African vaccinologist, Professor Glenda Gray, with whom I spent some time 2 weeks ago, tells me that her aspiration and her prayer is that we get a vaccine available globally within 18 months. So that would put us at about July next year. That would be phenomenal for the whole world. It would be a first, requiring all the safety trials and efficacy trials to be completed and all the regulatory approvals to have happened already. Of course, then there's the global manufacture and distribution challenge, which our Unilever colleagues on this call, Shobna, should understand. That's a massive challenge in and of itself. And South Africa, I'm not sure, will be the highest on the list to receive those vaccines. There'll be some prioritization triage, probably high-risk people getting it first, those of older age with comorbid diseases. And so it's a very complicated process. Could talk much more about it, but seeking to be brief.
No, but thank you so much. I mean, it's really incredible for me how this crisis has really helped us to innovate in our own collaboration. And that's what's leading some of this innovation going forward. Let's hope it sustains throughout the rest of the crisis as we solve it, as really this vaccine becomes something that could potentially be commercialized going forward. Our next poll question is really, as business sectors continue to be transformed by COVID-19, which innovations do you think will dominate in the next decade? Health, education, financial, retail, or technology? Kinsey, while we're waiting for that poll answer, it's been quite interesting for me how you were mentioning that you are, as a bank, even with your app, Avo app, are now interlinking and working with a number of different organizations. Do you think that the corporate world is much more open to working with other stakeholders? And does this extend into competing stakeholders too?
It's an interesting question. So I do think that the crisis has probably opened our eyes to the fact that when we do work together, our impact can be a lot more exponential. And if you listen to Ryan's response on the vaccine, I think it's quite an important one on the impact that we can make when we work together. We've seen it in banking, but I can't honestly say it's being driven necessarily by the need for innovation, but it has been driven by how we respond to the crisis. So if you look at some of the payment holidays that we've put in, decreasing SaaS-switch fees for clients, all of those things have actually been banks coming together and saying, actually, yes, from an economic perspective, which is, I think, the bigger long-term risk, right, when it comes to COVID-19, is people's livelihoods and all of that. We've been able to work together to come to some sort of solve. I could kumbaya and say that's what's going to happen in the long term. I'm not entirely sure, but I think it would be great if that happens. But for me, what's more important is if you think about, the Avo app and the API marketplace, it's about leveling the playing fields and almost democratizing access to open source, data and information to be able to create your own thing, even if you don't work at Nedbank. And I think that's where innovation is going to go. Just really allowing people to be able to connect onto your platform and create their own, products and services, which could be in competition to yourself, by the way. But I think that's where innovation is going to go.
Yeah, I really find it interesting that there's this kind of new opening up of cross-collaboration. And really, I think maybe there's a governance process that also needs to be developed simultaneously to make sure that can work without being anti-competitive. But I think that's stuff that will happen. The poll came out that technology at 65% is the business sector that you feel is really going to dominate from an innovation in over the next decade. There's a really interesting cross-collaboration innovation that happened that was led by Unilever. And I wanted to just play this video around something that Unilever did where it really required them to work across industry to develop something. So let's have this, and then we'll continue with the poll results after this.
Project of this scale and magnitude to be delivered so quickly from kickoff to launch within just 3 to 4 weeks was absolutely phenomenal. And this would not have been possible without the strong support from our cross-functional team. And this is just a big thank you to our supply chain teams, procurement teams, third-party teams, R&D teams, customer teams, everyone involved that I may not have mentioned. A big thank you from us because we really appreciate it. And it's going to go a long way in helping us prevent the spread of coronavirus within South Africa and Africa.
Shobna, I know that that really is, in a way, also a technological innovation. Do you really just want to give us some context around how that came about and what spurred it on?
So the demand for soap and sanitizer escalated with the start of COVID-19 in the country. And since we could not import as much as we needed to, we partnered locally with a supplier to then produce more than 10 million units. And I think while the poll showed that the concern is for the technology going forward, really what other polls have also showed is that the financial concern is the greatest for most citizens of South Africa. So what we're really looking at and are really concerned about is the income of SMMEs and how Unilever can support them through our supply chain. And this is a great example of not keeping just our own factories operating and running, but how we can keep SMMEs in business as well. From a technology perspective, the change in the pattern of behavior of consumers has seen the need for e-commerce having really grown. You've seen that you can now get your groceries delivered through the bigger retail outlets in 60 minutes or 60 minutes from ShopriteCheckers, Checkers, for example. The kind of home deliveries around recipes and chefs and food through Unilever. So one of the big challenges for us going forward with technology will be how we improve our e-commerce business, certainly through the new consumer trends that are building. And from a finance perspective, it's the biggest challenge for millennials who are facing jobs and the restriction of those, as well as SMMEs who are just so severely restricted in terms of lockdown and how they grow their business. So it's a combination of the finance and the technology. And we were very pleased to be able to produce Lifebuoy locally through a local supplier.
That's really incredible. Thank you for that. I'm going to go into our third poll. COVID has had a real impact on society, and it's forced us to think differently in many instances. People and companies have to relook how they do things and the way that they do things and function. What support role do you see banks playing in reviving the economy? One, by addressing the societal wealth gap between the rich and the poor, becoming directly involved in job creation, to help create business models that are easy to implement, to influence and support education systems that allow for upskilling of young people, or to recognize and help to fund social innovations. Let us know your thoughts. Kensi, I'm obviously going to come back to you with that particular response, but I wanted to go back to Pritesh from a moment. I mean, Pritesh, you spoke about how young people are able to really kind of upskill themselves, and your organization is helping in that regard. But I'm also interested in how are we upskilling older people, because there's a lot of people who are in the economic system that wouldn't necessarily consider themselves young anymore. But isn't it more difficult to upskill as you get older? And what advice would you give in that level of upskillment?
Yeah, I've had a lot of chats about this, and I think one of the key things that I always speak to people about is we have to remove this ageist kind of concept in terms of the ability of individuals to upskill themselves and access new thinking and new technology and new abilities. And I think that's one of the things that we're seeing. And it may be largely because, you know, we work in an innovation sector and we work within the creative industry where people are receptive and open to the ideas of actually exploring new thinking, new innovation. But I think that the first start is, as society, if we remove this notion that the older members of our society have this inherent disdain for new technology and new thinking, that will help us be more receptive to actually sharing this with them. And the more that we actually share with them, the more likely they are to imbibe this. I mean, if you have a look at it, a lot of people said that WhatsApp would never be used by older people. Today, most older people that I know of are using WhatsApp. They said that Facebook was for younger people when it was launched. Today, Facebook, as most people are finding it, is primarily and largely used by older people who are 50 plus right now in terms of some of the numbers that I'm seeing out there. So I do think that's the key thing that we need to recognize, is that in terms of upskilling older people, the first is that we have to understand that they're receptive and willing, and if we remove this ageist ideas, we will find that they'll be very receptive and use the technology that's available.
Yeah, I feel like one of the innovations that's required is really how to use Zoom and Skype and Blue Jeans, Microsoft Teams, any of these new video platforms that we just need to get our way around. I mean, I've been in some meetings where there have been complete faux pas around where the mute button is and using the mute button. But the answer, the kind of the highest rated in terms of the response from the poll has been to recognize and help to fund social innovations. Obviously, funding and raising capital for social innovations is always going to be a hot topic of discussion, Kensi. What role has, how has the bank evolved in analyzing, applying their minds on these social innovations and being able to fund and track them? Because I can imagine that there's thousands coming at you every single day.
Yeah.
Have you refined a process around how to evaluate and fund those initiatives?
Yeah, so firstly, I absolutely love the answer. And I think it actually speaks completely to the core of who we are as a bank. And I always like to remind people, if you go back to the idea of sort of shared value or, your purpose, when we launched the affinities sort of 20, 30 years ago, where every time you transacted on something with the bank, we would put money to whether it was the Nelson Mandela Trust or the Green Trust. So at the core of who we are as a brand, sort of the shared value space is really important for us. So if I look at the response, for us, it's very much linked to the Sustainable Development Goals, so the SDG goals, which is a big part of how we measure how successful we are in the context of achieving our purpose. One of the big things we did last year, because you can talk about sort of the SDG goals and never live up to them. So one of the big things we did is each of the SDG goals are actually given to an EXCO member. That EXCO member has to drive them within the organization, drive the measurement and tracking of it. So I look after SDG 12, for example, which is a production and consumption goal. And it helps because you really drive the momentum of it within the organization. We've created an app within the bank where all the sort of deals that are done within the SDG space are recorded on that app so that we have a baseline, and then we can put the goals of where we want to go in terms of the deals that we want to achieve in that space. But it is a key and core part of how we believe we will achieve our purpose. And I'm really glad to see, because I do think if we drive innovation in that space, I do think we're going to start to see a reduction in a lot of the social ills that we have.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, what's interesting for me, and I think we're going into the next part of this discussion where we're going to free flow a little bit more because we're now done with the Zoom polls. And by the way, audience, please submit your questions that I will put to the panel a little bit later in this discussion. I mean, innovation is a really important topic, and Ryan, certainly, Discovery has been one of those organizations that's really been at the forefront of innovation. So I'm really interested in what have you put in place as an organization to ensure that innovation comes through, that great ideas really manage to kind of see themselves through and are sustained, especially in this type of environment. And while you're answering that, Shobna, I'd like you to also, from almost an FMCG perspective, also think about how innovation has been organized in your own organization. So Ryan?
Yeah, I would say 3 quick answers, AB, to summarize that. The first is that innovation is central to our being. It's in our DNA. It's part of our value system, and it's who we are. It's a little bit like asking a professional tennis player, how did you get such a good forehand? They've just done it their whole lives. It's what they do all day, every day. They eat, sleep, and breathe it. So that's part one. It's a cultural thing. Part two, notwithstanding the cultural side, there is serious engagement and a structural design for top-down support around innovation. And to give you a concrete example of that, every Friday morning for 5 hours, we have 4 CEOs who work together with an R&D lab of 15 actuarial people who spend the whole Friday morning every week as sacred time just on innovation, on R&D and on product development. And that's a CEO level commitment. I should be there now. I've left that meeting to come and join this webinar. Today being Friday, and it really has to be the exception for us not to be there. We by example, we really invest in that. And then the third part is, from a grassroots perspective, some of our best ideas come from our people at grassroots who are exposed to problems every day. And so we have company-wide innovation competitions. I know it's something that Unilever does too. We have management incentive structures built around it. We have an actuarial conference every year where the actuaries present their innovations. We have similarly for our technology cluster and our operations clusters. And so we have a very well-defined structured program to support the culture of ground-up innovation too. And I would say those are the 3 main underpins.
That's really incredible. I mean, that is a huge time commitment for CEOs to be sitting every single week looking at innovation and pipeline. That's really incredible. Shobna, I know that in many ways we look at tech companies as the ones that are pushing and advancing innovation, but also there's been a lot of innovation in the FMCG space. How is Unilever managing innovation and stimulating it?
So at Unilever, we too have an entire division dedicated to R&D. And in the short term, you might have noticed that Lifebuoy has worked very hard to come and be the first in the world to actually say that Lifebuoy, destroys the COVID-19 germ in 99.9% of it. And Domestos is also going to be able to do that in your home care environment as well. So that is the kind of short-term claim that we're able to make through R&D and existing SKUs, and really looking hard at our portfolio where we can amplify benefits around the superior quality of our products through R&D. In the medium term, it will be around how we accelerate the relevant innovations, especially in healthcare, convenience, snacking in foods, and widening the antibacterial portfolio in our beauty and personal care portfolio, as well as building a really strong hygiene and your antibacterial presence in your home. I think in the long term, it's going to be about how we recession-proof our portfolio of products and in the areas that COVID-19 have benefited the portfolio. So R&D is really about innovating in the product and the portfolio space as well as packaging. But coming back to how you meet the needs of the consumer space, and Kensani touched on the social challenges, especially in lockdown, it was how you give consumers and communities help when everybody's locked down. And a very topical and a hard social issue is, for example, women who face domestic violence issues and being locked down. And we've seen an increase in that during lockdown. And one of our tea brands, Joko, for example, has looked at how we help shelters. So again, it's innovating even in the social environment space, where you can now help communities even in a lockdown environment. And that has taken a great deal of partnership, both with government, for example, the Department of Health, where we gave away more than 1 million bars of soap for clinics with doctors and nurses who see the benefit of that, as well as patients, and through the Department of Education. So it's innovating in every sphere of the business to be connected to consumers and communities.
Thank you for that. I mean, certainly your last word there was really consumers and communities. And there's a lot of ideas that are coming up from consumers and communities that they believe could be activated and really brought to life by your organizations. There's a question here from Beatrice, who's just asked, what are the things that corporate companies pay attention to when receiving a proposal request for a partnership from NGOs or micro-scale investors? Let me pop this to Kensi, and then if anyone else would like to take that on, that would be great. So really, what are you looking for when people come up with ideas for innovation?
Yeah, so I think the first thing is it has to be linked and related to our purpose and who we are as a brand. So that's an important lens that we use. And I think sometimes, and obviously there's a lot of social ills in South Africa, and it's easy to sort of think everything's going to be important. But if it doesn't link to your North Star as a brand, then I don't think you should look at it, because it's landing something that completely goes against your brand. Secondly, it also links to what we've identified as how we can impact South Africa going forward, which is around skills development as well as education. So it's important that before you go send a proposal to an organization, that you understand what their sort of parameters that they've put in place around how they are going to judge whether or not they get involved in some NGO with an NGO. It's important for you to understand that upfront, so that when you build your proposal, you actually are building it based on the understanding of the brand and what the parameters that they've put for which NGOs that they'll work with. Interestingly enough, for the COVID-19 crisis, we actually, because we focus on skills development and education, but you can imagine during this crisis, we then had to look at testing as well as being able to provide food for people in such a dire environment. So we actually went out to look for partners that we would work with, like the Red Cross, like Doctors Without Borders, who are not people that we were working with in the context of skills development and education. But the crisis then said we had to look at different partners. Going forward, we will still go back to what our anchor is from a bank perspective, and only look at working with NGOs who fall into that space.
Thank you for that. I think you raise a good point around innovations and the investment that companies make really need to be linked to the North Star of an organization. I think often companies don't have a clearly communicated North Star and those criteria set up. So I think that might be something helpful for us to reflect on, so that customers are not just trying to decipher that themselves by the comms that they see. So I'd really like to challenge us to kind of look at all our communications and see if that works. Does anyone else want to kind of tackle what they look for when customers and communities are coming up with ideas?
Maybe if I can add something to that as well, but maybe from the other side. And that is that I understand that brands and organizations, because I've worked on both sides, are very cognitive of the fact that they want to ensure that there's a very strong message in terms of what the direction is and what they support. But it's not always possible, purely because there's so many different areas and so many different touch points that the brand is actually looking at, that sometimes it does get muddled. So the advice is also to the NGOs and nonprofit organizations out there, is that what I noticed with a lot of proposals that used to come through back in my previous life in the brand side was it was very generic. It was always generic in terms of very internally focused as the NGO in terms of what we're doing and what we want to do and what we want to achieve. And I think that's why a lot of these proposals fall by the wayside. If you actually think about how you actually tailor make every single proposal for every single organization that you share it with, then you will ensure that it resonates with the leadership team within that organization. So as the NPO, think about who you're speaking to, what your audience is, and what are some of the things that they're actually trying to deliver. Tailor make your proposal to them based on that, and you're more likely to get that meeting that ultimately leads to success.
And if I can add a comment here, and this may sound so silly in some respects, but actually it's just, I think, such a useful practical tip in this debate. Brevity is critically important. Just a concise, short proposal. I tell you, I receive many of these proposals, probably 10 a week. And when they come across my desk, there are sometimes 35 pages of proposal. And
Wow.
you have to flip through those pages to try and actually understand what's being asked. And I get a knot in my stomach when I look at that and, try and give the right attention to each one. But actually the 2-page proposal with a very clear elevator pitch, as Pritesh said, something that's relevant to the reader, to our business. And that's, very briefly and properly articulated at a macro level is all you need to open the door. And the details should follow. And it's just such a common mistake that so many NPOs, and for that matter, young entrepreneurs who are making pitches, seem to recurrently make.
Yeah, I think that's very, very helpful. What's interesting for me is, as these large organizations, there's almost this kind of expectation that you will just kind of process every single document and be able to revert to people. But I really like that point around, brevity is really, really important. Be clear and then be clever. There's another question here around, from an anonymous attendee that says, you've been able to innovate through this crisis, or innovating through this crisis. What are the challenges that you faced? So Shobna, have you experienced some challenges in being able to come up with some of these innovations? And what have they been? And I'd like other panelists to really pick up on that.
So I think with especially the lockdown, the production process is always challenged by raw materials and that supply, as well as COVID-19 itself. If employees are not well and are COVID positive, we really took all of the precautions to ensure that our employees followed the full process. And so if a factory was closed due to COVID-19, how did we, manage through that supply process? And so it really is putting the safety and the health of employees at the forefront of our business. That was number one for us. Secondly, the production and the process. We had an incredible supply chain team who worked through those challenges. And thirdly, it was really looking at what products was needed to be at the forefront of the fight of COVID and really moving that up into the production line. So from an innovation perspective, again, it was really looking at how you reformulate into those products. But I think there's also the challenge currently of one cannot ignore the societal current events in terms of what's going on in the United States and the sad passing of George Flynn, for example. And it's very relevant for South Africa, given our history. And consumers are looking to organizations and its leadership and what brands do, and are saying it's not okay to just talk out against racism. Brands have to actively do the right thing. And if you look at Nike, for example, really lauded for taking a very strong step towards this. And Ben & Jerry's, with Unilever in the US, and our own CEO, who came out very early and said we absolutely denounce racism in all of its forms. And so you cannot, as a corporate and a global national conglomerate, ignore the societal trends and go about your business as normal. So I think coupled with COVID-19, the issues of racism, the issues of violence have to prevail in your planning so that there is respect and dignity for the very consumers who buy it. And that is a challenge for us at Unilever, where we are talking to our employees about how they feel, given the history that we have in the country, and how our brands will respond with those social factors in mind. And I think that it's going to be a challenge for us currently and into the future.
Thank you very much. We probably have about 4 minutes left, and I'd like to take this opportunity to really thank the panelists for your contribution. And I'd like to go through each of you and just ask you to give us kind of a 30-minute soundbite of what is your message to the participants today of how we can all together come through this COVID-19 crisis that's been created. I'm going to start with Kenzie. We're going to go ladies first and end off with the thorns after we're done with the roses.
Thanks, AB. I think for me, if I reflect on the conversation, it's really around how do we start to democratize innovation and make it accessible, open systems. So as I spoke about from an API perspective, but one of the best examples that I've seen of that is a company called Dimargi, which is a US-based company. So they've basically given pro bono subscriptions to its open source mobile data platform to allow people to be able to create COVID-19 response apps. I absolutely love that. And I actually think if we want to spur on innovation, especially in the context of the decreasing our social ills or being able to achieve the SDG goals, we're going to have to be a bit more open around our capability and our technology and who we were able to give access to it, still understanding that we have to keep our competitive edge, obviously. So
Sure.
For me, I think that's been, quite important, and hopefully it's something that we'll be able to achieve.
Thank you very much. Shobna, your closing words?
I'd like for us as a business to innovate so that we pay our suppliers, pay our employees, and eventually be able to sustain our business in a way that grows, and innovate our products so that we are able to fight COVID-19 on the front line and produce products that our consumers actually need so that their homes can be cleaned in a safe way and their hands can be washed in a safe way, and COVID-19 can be fought overall.
Thank you so much. Pritesh? Yeah, I think the message that I'd like to leave everyone with is maintain a strong innovation momentum to ensure strong innovation pipelines. One of the things that I saw post the 2008 financial crisis is that as much as there was appetite for innovation from consumer side, a lot of brands chose to stop doing it. And what they did was they looked at, how can I focus on my mother brand? How can I stop doing a lot of this communication? Because innovation does cost money and time and resources. But if you don't put the time, resources, and money into innovation now when consumers need it the most, you're setting yourself back. So maintain your innovation pipeline and maintain the momentum that's required to meet consumer needs. Thank you so much. Ryan?
Thanks, AB. Very useful discussion. My message is really an appeal to say, tear down traditional barriers, collaborate across historic silos, and make sure that across public, private, through all the equity and equality gaps, we break down those barriers to innovate collectively. That for me is the outstanding feature of this COVID-19 innovation challenge. Is how people have come together across all these traditional barriers, torn them down and succeeded in innovation. It's almost an inspiring moment from an innovative perspective. We've seen in healthcare change that we thought would take 5 to 6 years to happen. We've seen it happen in 3 months with a shift to digital, to telemedicine, and to digital healthcare and virtual consultations and the like. And so we think, we have to look at the good emerging from this period, and we have to try and capitalize on that and make the world a better place to live in. AB, I thought I would end by asking you what you think, your 30-second learnings are from innovation and what you're seeing from a Vodacom perspective.
I think, thank you so much for that, Ryan. If there's anything I've realized is that together we can do more. I think it's important for companies to have a very clear North Star so that they know what they're trying to achieve, so that they can galvanize all their resources around purpose and around shared value. Because once you've got that clear North Star, it's easier to facilitate the partnerships, the ideation, the innovation, the pipelines, your hiring policies, your investment policies. So my parting words is really be clear on a personal level around what your purpose is, be clear on an organizational level around your purpose is, and you can really use that to unlock the innovation and the partnerships that are needed to make the world a better place. So on that, panelists, I really want to thank you so much for your participation. I think Ryan's going back to his CEO meeting now. I look forward to working with all of you in all our different spheres to really move this world forward at pace. So thank you very much. I'd like to hand back over to Hlubi.
Thank you, AB. Good job.
Thank you, guys.
Cheers.
Thank you.
Cheers, everyone.
Thanks, Abby.
Bye. Hlubi isn't back on yet, it seems.
Hello?
How are you, Hlubi? Back to you.
But AB, can you hear me?
I can.
Okay, I'm going to continue talking. If ever there was a moment that we felt and left completely energized by this panel discussion, it is now, and I can affirm this with quite firm authority. If ever there was a time, there we go.
Hello.
If ever there was a time there was transformational leadership based on values and ethics and vision and authenticity, it is now. So I want to say from me, Hlubi Mboya, to the panel, and of course our highly esteemed moderator, thank you so much. Thank you so much. You've left us with inspiration. You've left us with actionable things to do, and you've motivated us in these really hard times. But we're going to pioneer and build things to build a sustainable future. Thank you so much to AB, Dr. Ryan, Shobna, Pritesh, and Sis Kensani.